Welcome to Session 2. This session will focus on several forms that are found in the handbook. Look at page 22 from the handbook. We refer to this chart as the pacing schedule or calendar for the clinical teaching semester. This pacing schedule serves as a guide for the gradual progression of a clinical teacher towards full responsibility. It provides both clinical teachers and cooperating teachers with a suggested plan, a plan for assuming responsibility for the planning and instruction of subject areas in the elementary grades or blocks of time such as periods or classes in middle school and high school. I will thoroughly explain this pacing schedule or chart. Let's begin with the note at the bottom of the page. It's extremely important. It states that this pacing schedule is only a suggestion. It can definitely be adjusted. So, depending on the clinical teacher situation, the pace can be slower or faster. Do allow for flexibility. Each clinical teacher may have a totally different pacing schedule, and that's fine. The pacing schedule can be solely determined by the cooperating teacher, or it can be a joint effort where it is determined by the cooperating teacher and clinical teacher working together. It is actually the cooperating teacher's choice as to how this decision is made. Beginning with week 1, the clinical teacher will observe, assist, team teach. After week 1, the idea is to gradually add subjects, blocks of time, periods each week until the clinical teacher has assumed the responsibility for planning and teaching approximately half of the instructional time in any given day. Once this has happened, the 1/2 is not to be exceeded until the clinical teacher is in full responsibility. So let me clarify the 1/2 concept with the numbers. If, for example, there are 4 hours of instructional time in one day, the clinical teacher would work up to the point of being responsible for approximately 2 of the 4 hours of instructional time each day. Or, if there are 6 subjects or periods each day, being responsible for half the day would equal 3 subjects or periods. Once the clinical teacher has reached the point of planning and teaching approximately 1/2 of any given day, then before a new subject, block of time, or period is added, a subject or block of time that has been taught the longest would need to be dropped. The process of dropping before adding would continue until the clinical teacher has rotated through each subject area or block of time or period, and this is important, been responsible for every part of the day. Now the clinical teacher is ready for full responsibility. Hopefully this process of rotating the clinical teacher through all the subjects or blocks of time in a day can be accomplished by week 7 at the very latest, hopefully much sooner. So to clarify A&M's approach to pacing, rather than add until clinical teacher is in full responsibility, our approach is to add subjects or blocks of time until the clinical teacher is responsible for approximately 1/2 of the instructional day. At this point, we drop subjects or blocks of time as new subjects or blocks of time are added. This prevents the clinical teacher from being responsible for more than 1/2 of the instructional day until he or she is actually in full responsibility. Scan down the pacing schedule to weeks 5 through 7. Full responsibility consists of 10 consecutive days. So full responsibility could either be weeks 5 and 6 or 6 and 7, and it may even have to be weeks 7 and 8, and that's okay. So remember that this is a suggested pacing schedule. The important thing is to be flexible. 10 consecutive days do not always work out due to staff development days, holidays, testing, etc. Just skip over these days and continue counting to 10. I want to stress 10 consecutive days if possible, because even though we prefer 10 consecutive days, it is okay if in the middle of the 10 days, for example, the cooperating teacher needs the class back for a day or 2 of testing required by the district. That's fine. In fact, it's okay to split the full responsibility into 2 one-week sessions. For example, the clinical teacher could be in full responsibility week 5, take week 6 to reflect, and then resume full responsibility with week 7. Flexibility is always important, but especially during the spring semester. Make sure, though, that there is a total of 10 days for each full responsibility, even if they are not consecutive days. The midpoint conference works out well during week 7 for me, personally. Second environment is mentioned as an option in this same box. There's more information on page 5 in the handbook about second environment, but it's simply a maximum of 5 days of observing in other classrooms. It could occur here after the first full responsibility, or could be saved for the end of clinical teaching. It could also be scattered out over several weeks. Leave this up to the cooperating teacher and the clinical teacher. It's their choice. Once this first full responsibility is complete, the clinical teacher drops back to being responsible for approximately 1/2 of the instructional time each day. See weeks 8 through 10 on the pacing schedule. The clinical teacher will rotate through different subjects, periods, or blocks of time as he or she prepares for the second full responsibility. Remember that second environment is still an option during this block of time. Look at the second full responsibility at the bottom of the pacing schedule. Second full responsibility consists of 10, hopefully consecutive days during weeks 12 and 13 or weeks 13 and 14. Again, be flexible. Let the cooperating teacher determine what will work best in his or her classroom. The final conference is best conducted sometime during weeks 13 or 14. While we're looking at this pacing schedule, it's a good time to point out some ideal times for you to make your 4 formal observations. You may want to jot these suggestions down. A high visit is highly suggested during the first week. Pop in, see where the clinical teacher's desk is, where the clinical teacher will keep his or her clinical teaching notebook. We will discuss details about the notebook in session 4 of this online orientation. The first formal observation for each clinical teacher should occur during either week 3 or week 4, so make note of that. The second formal observation should occur when the clinical teacher is in his or her first full responsibility, so that could be during weeks 5, 6, or 7. The third formal observation will be after the midpoint conference and will occur during weeks 8, 9, or 10. The fourth formal observation should occur when the clinical teacher is in his or her second full responsibility, so this would be during weeks 11, 12, or 13. This is important. More than 4 observations might be needed if the clinical teacher is experiencing difficulties. At this point, you may be wondering why the 4 weeks of full responsibility are split into two-week experiences of full responsibility, and our reasons are simple. By the end of the first full responsibility, each clinical teacher is well aware of the strengths and struggles that surface during those 2 weeks. The split gives the clinical teacher time to reflect on what went well and what did not. In addition, the split provides an opportunity for the clinical teacher to observe the cooperating teacher or other teachers in the grade level, and these teachers could model strategies that may solve issues that the clinical teacher encountered. It gives the cooperating teacher in particular the opportunity to model effective strategies that the clinical teacher can incorporate as he or she begins to build toward the second full responsibility. Now look at page 23 in the handbook. This is the projected pacing schedule. This chart provides a visual of the entire semester. It is a clinical teacher's responsibility to fill out this chart based on the decisions made from discussing the options presented on page 22, which is the pacing schedule or calendar. When this chart is filled out, you will be able to see at a glance what the clinical teacher is teaching and when he or she is teaching it. It will clearly show which subject area the clinical teacher will assume responsibility for first, second, and so on. It can be filled out by hand or generated on the computer. The clinical teachers will be able to use this example from the handbook as a guide for composing their own charts. Now let's look at the 2 colorful examples of projected pacing schedules. These were composed on the computer by former clinical teachers. One is from the spring of 18, when we only needed 14 weeks, while the other is from the spring of 19, which extended into week 15. They illustrate how different each clinical teacher's pacing schedules will be based on their individual placements. Notice the dates across the top of each chart. Notice that subjects are listed down the left side of one chart, while class periods are listed on the other chart. Both charts are shaded in to indicate the subjects or blocks of time where the clinical teacher will be responsible for lesson plans and instruction. A color-coded key is at the bottom of each projected schedule to represent subjects or periods taught, as well as full responsibility days, staff development days, holidays, district testing days, career fair, etc. In these examples, you are able to see, beginning in week 2, what the clinical teacher's responsibilities are. The first and second full responsibilities show up really well. You're able to easily count to make sure that there are 10 days for each full responsibility. You're able to spot check and make sure that prior to the first full responsibility, no clinical teacher is responsible for more than 1/2 of each day. The pacing schedule should be turned in to you either electronically or in a hard copy form as soon as possible, but no later than the end of the 3rd week. Locate page 24 in the handbook. It is entitled Weekly Clinical Teaching Schedule. The clinical teachers will fill this out at the end of each week to reflect what they are responsible for teaching the following week. It can be sent to you either electronically or hand-delivered as a hard copy. It's your choice. It is due to you by a certain time of your choosing each Friday evening or by noon on Saturday. Again, your choice. This means that the first weekly schedule is due to you at the end of the first week and reflects what the cooperating teacher is teaching the following week, which would be week 2. This same procedure is followed for each of the remaining weeks. The clinical teachers may compose an electronic replica of this chart or make hard copies of the blank chart and fill in the needed data by hand. It is their choice. This weekly schedule will allow you to see at a glance what and when each cooperating clinical teacher is teaching on any given day. You will use these weekly schedules to determine your schedule of observations for each week. Now that you know the purpose of the weekly schedule and a few particulars such as when it is due, let's inspect the blank chart itself. In the row across the top of the chart, the clinical teacher will record the entire day, including each subject or period with the time that subject or period is taught. Lunch, conference time, recess, etc. should all be included with times. Inside each box, there should be a brief explanation of what will be taught during that lesson or block of time. You may find this information useful in deciding which lesson to observe. One word, a phrase would all be appropriate. Words or phrases like test, guest speaker, movie, field trip, etc. would all indicate lessons that would not be good to observe. An empty box means that the cooperating teacher, not the clinical teacher, is responsible for that lesson or block of time. Let the clinical teachers know that there will be quite a few empty boxes during the first couple of weeks. Now let's look at a sample of a weekly schedule. It's part of the miscellaneous handouts that you assembled before viewing this session. It's colorful and has weekly clinical teaching schedule typed across the top. Notice the subjects and times across the top of the chart. There is a color-coded key at the bottom. Vertical columns are used for non-teaching parts of the day, such as lunch, conference period, recess, etc. Here is a suggestion which you readily see in this example. Have the clinical teachers highlight in different colors information that you decide would be helpful on the weekly schedule. Notice in this example, the lessons that would be good for me to observe are highlighted. They happen to be blue in this example. An interruption to the normal schedule which in this case is Motor Lab on Monday and Friday, is highlighted in orange. In this example, the lessons that are taught by the clinical teacher at a time different than the time recorded at the top of the column have the correct times typed inside of the proper boxes and are highlighted in yellow. Note the 6 boxes on Wednesday where this occurs. In summary, I had my clinical teachers highlight 3 things on their weekly schedules. First, they highlight lessons that they think would be good for me to observe. Secondly, in a different color, they highlight anything that interrupts the normal schedule, such as library, counselor, assembly, grade level testing or district testing, a special lab, etc. This ensures that the interruption to the normal schedule just sort of jumps out at me. Finally, if they're teaching at a time that is different than the time recorded at the top of the column, I have them record the time they are teaching inside the proper box and highlight it. For example, they may only be teaching the last 45 minutes of a period that is 90 minutes long. I need to know that, so I will show up at the right time. Remember, this is what works for me. It's only a suggestion. I do, however, highly recommend sharing examples such as the projected pacing schedule and weekly schedule with your clinical teachers. A visual is generally very helpful for the clinical teachers. Here's one final suggestion. It is a good idea to have your clinical teachers let you know when there are changes to their weekly schedules so that you will not show up at a time when they are no longer teaching. This concludes Session 2.